I'd like to begin today's virtual health equity summit with a land acknowledgement. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather virtually on this land and thank the generations of Indigenous people who have taken care of this land long before other nation groups came. We acknowledge that the work of CASSA takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, see Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning trees in the water, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth for the resources we are using and honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on this land since time immemorial. This recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. As today's session focuses on health equity, it is particularly important for us to recognize the severity of health inequities in Indigenous communities. We stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities in calls to all levels of government to develop Indigenous-led health policies and practices that are informed by Indigenous healing practices. We must also hold our government and health institutions accountable and advocate for increasing equitable access to healthcare for Indigenous people. We also need to continuously educate ourselves about the colonial history of this country and understand how the wrongdoing of the past still impacts the health and well-being of Indigenous communities. I encourage everyone at this session to actively seek information and take action, especially as we recognize the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th. For those of you that are not familiar with the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, although I do see a lot of familiar names, we have, as you know, this is the 10th annual summit. So we've been doing this for over a decade now. And there's people that attend this summit almost every year. So welcome back. And for those of you that are attending for the first time, welcome to CASSA and welcome to our family and welcome to our members. So CASSA is a not-for-profit social justice umbrella organization. We represent over 120 member agencies across the province, generally concentrated around the Greater Toronto area, but we also have quite a lot of projects and ongoing activities across the country these days. CASSA aims to build the capacity of South Asian communities to be able to participate fully in political, economic, cultural, and social fabric of Canadian society. As an organization that's focused on advocacy, training, capacity building, and policy change, our focus is not on frontline services. Rather, it's on influencing systemic, strategic, and policy level changes to improve the outcomes and well-being of South Asian communities in Ontario. Our current strategic directions include promoting health equity, reducing poverty, supporting immigration and settlement, strengthening gender equity, and building an anti-racist and anti-oppressive Ontario. We partner with our member agencies and other social justice organizations across the country to work towards our strategic directions. As some of you are well aware, CASSA's Health Equity Summits have been central to the work that we have been doing on health equity for the last 10 years. The objective of this summit, of these summits, is to allow South Asians and other racialized communities to discuss how we can work together to influence strategic system level changes, which will help improve the health outcomes of our communities. Typically, like I mentioned earlier, the summit is an in-person event, and the last time we had an in-person event was in 2019 before the pandemic, and it was a very successful event. We had over 100 attendees. We were sold out of tickets. It was a paid event, and so we were really excited to kind of produce that kind of level of experience for our members and our attendees. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to do any more in-person summits, but we hope through the new platform that we're using, you can use some of these features, which I will talk a little bit about later, to get that kind of experience. So the focus on last year's summit, so we actually had a smaller virtual forum last year on health equity. The focus of that was on the beginning phases of the COVID-19 emergency care and response. And this year, as we've learned more, it's been over 18 months since we've been in this pandemic. We hope that we can continue these conversations across the 2 days, so today and tomorrow, between 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. But we are focusing on concerns with reopening society after months of social isolation. The experts that will be joining us today will include Dr. Vinita Dubey, Kidon Diaz, Sana Imran, Mani Chahal, Corey Barnard, Stephen Peterson, Janiel Limbacha, Sojani Kandasamy, and Walid Kobali. The plenary speakers will discuss on access to critical health, mental health, and addictions, while the breakout speakers will discuss things like data collection and decision making, effective communication strategies, and a framework for community engagement. If you're able to join us tomorrow, and we have again an amazing set of speakers tomorrow as well, we will be continuing our discussion on things like stigma, discrimination, violence, and human rights, as well as building resilience for future public health crises. And I can assure you it's going to be just as much as a learning opportunity as today is. I highly encourage everyone to join for both days to get the full experience of the summit, and to gain incredible knowledge from our renowned speakers. Throughout the summit, we will demonstrate our collective capacity to improve health equity in ongoing and future public health crises. And finally, I want to thank the Punjabi Health Community Services for always being by our side and supporting the summit through gold sponsorship. And if we have Amandeep in the room, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Punjabi Community Health Services, or PCHS, I would like her to bring some greetings. So, Madiba, do we have Amandeep in the room?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect. Good morning. I'm very pleased to provide opening remarks on behalf of Baldev Mehta, Chief Executive Officer, Punjabi Community Health Services. So PCHS is a social service agency founded back in 1990. We are excited to be part of CASSA's 10th annual Health Equity Summit. And I congratulate CASA for being there for those sensitive topics which no one likes to touch. We always say the system doesn't work, but the system does work for those whom it is created for. And CASA is always advocating on the behalf of diverse communities to adapt the system that works for us. This is something I would like to um, appreciate CASA for always taking those mold steps. So I congratulate all the speakers who took the time from their busy schedule today to be part of this summit, and also congratulate CASA and all the participants. This is going to be awesome 2 days event. Congratulations, and I welcome everyone to this amazing event.
Thank you so much, Amandeep, for your kind words. And please pass on our appreciation to Baldevji as well. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it due to another commitment, and always striving and fighting for his communities, of course. So there's a couple of details that I would like to point out. I know that I see in our session, there's some people that are still not connected to audio. So maybe Madiba, if you want to send them a chat message and just let them know to join via computer audio, that would be great, because they won't be able to hear us until they join audio. Um, and if you can hear us and you're having trouble joining audio and connecting your mic, again, so if you go to the feed loop at the bottom of the screen, there's a join audio button there. If you could click there, that would be amazing. For our speakers, if you're not able to start your video, you can either click the start video button at the bottom of your feed loop screen, or if at the top where there's the videos of the speakers, there's a mute button, and right beside that there's three dots. Click on the three dots and that will let you start your video. All right. So a couple more things about FeedLoop. Given that's it's our first year hosting the summit on FeedLoop, we hope you forgive us in advance. We're asking for forgiveness in advance if there are any technical issues. We do have live support from FeedLoop that we subscribe to. So hopefully we can get those kind of technical glitches resolved. In a timely manner. But obviously, at the end of the summit, we are always open to feedback, constructive criticism on how we can do better. So we hope you take full advantage of this unique virtual learning experience, our extended schedule, and all the amazing networking opportunities and more. Although it will not be the same as an in-person summit, we worked very hard to provide you with a similar experience. And on that note, I just wanted to, it's not part of my speaking notes that Madiba created for me, but I do want to thank Madiba, who has been working on the summit day and night to try to create a good experience for our attendees, has been really amazing at organizing the summit, taking care of all the small details. And obviously, we could not have done this without her help. So thank you, Madiba, for all the amazing things that you've done to get us to today. So throughout the summit, you will have a chance to connect with other attendees and speakers in a variety of ways. So you can connect with the attendees using the summit-wide feature in the lobby area. So if you go to the lobby area, so in the actual feed loop on the left side, there's a panel and it has lobby and sessions and speakers. So feel free to play around with that and navigate that in between during the breaks. But if you want to chat with all of the attendees, there's a lobby area and there's a chat feature in that lobby area. And so if you click on the sessions on, again, the left panel, you can view all of the content of the summit. So for today and for tomorrow, you will have access to the live webinar and additional information about each session, such as speakers, description, or any other relevant files. To view the full screen, you have to click on the view button that's on the top right corner and then full screen of the video player. You can also engage in live Q&A using the video player's chat feature. So once you're in the video, there is a chat feature at the bottom of the screen. You just hit the chat feature and you can start communicating via chat. In the account area, which is on your top right, please feel free to complete your profile. So this will allow speakers to understand where people are coming from, where they're working, to connect your social media accounts and upload any documents that you would like to share with other attendees. In the networking area under the People tab, you can search through attendees and speakers to view their profile or initiate one-on-one conversations. So I know there's a lot of instructions, but we'll post it in the chat as well so that if you forget anything or if you're not understanding things that as I'm speaking very fast, then you can go back to our instructions in the chat. Notifications will appear on the top right-hand corner of every page that will alert you of any chat notifications and important announcements from summit organizers. If you're experiencing any trouble, you can connect with the event admin using the private chat feature. So the private chat feature you can see is right on the left side of the video. You can find the instructions that I just outlined also in the help tab on the left side of the website. So if you click the help tab, all of these instructions will be there. So don't forget to share your excitement and thoughts on social media as well. So remember to tag our Twitter, our Facebook, and our Instagram handle, which is CASSA Online, and use the hashtags 2021 Health Equity Summit and CASSA Health Equity Summit. I also want to make note that the summit will be recorded, as I mentioned earlier, and the recorded version of the summit will be available to stream on YouTube, again, for those individuals that aren't able to make it today due to scheduling conflicts. We also have a feedback surveys for both of the days of the summit. So at the end of the summit, the survey will appear as a pop-up towards the end of the afternoon sessions. So once you see that pop up, please don't forget to fill it out. It's not extensive. It'll take you less than 2 minutes before leaving today, as it helps us, like I mentioned, to improve and provide better experience for the summit. So, with that being said, I promise for the rest of the day, I'm not going to speak as much. Um, and I'm going to move into our plenary sessions. All right. So, the first speaker for today is going to be on mental health and addiction concerns. And we have Sana Imran. Sana Imran is a registered social worker and psychotherapist with several years of experience working frontline in community mental health and addiction agencies across Toronto. Most recently, Sana led health equity policy initiatives and programs for the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario. She is currently an assistant dean of community wellness with Innis College at the University of Toronto. She continues to provide clinical care part-time and is passionate about reducing stigma and enhancing culturally safe care for communities experiencing marginalization. Sana will be addressing what to expect as staff are being asked to move back into the workplace and how we can better support their transition. Please join me in welcoming Sana Imran to our platform.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Just let me know if you're having trouble hearing me. I'm trying to navigate this new system as well. I'm not that familiar with Heedlu, but we'll see how this goes. Hey everyone, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Samia. So I guess I'm starting today, and so we're going to talk a little bit about mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic, but specifically through the lens of race and experiences of racism. As Samia mentioned, I'm a social worker by background, and I do currently work with the University of Toronto. I'm not speaking today as a representative of the university, but rather as a social worker and a psychotherapist who works very closely with clients of racialized backgrounds and in learning from their experiences over the past year and a half and before. So I wanted to obviously start off by acknowledging really that no matter where we are standing on Indigenous land. I think this is really important to address and is especially dear to me as an immigrant to this country and going through my own journey of learning and unlearning what I was taught growing up. And so today we're all joining the summit from our own homes and our respective workplaces. I'm specifically in my own home, if you couldn't tell from my background, which is actually in Vaughan. So the city of Vaughan is what I'll speak to more directly, is situated in the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. The city of Vaughan is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people today. And as a representative of the city of Vaughan, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory. So I'm going to speak quite briefly on the topic of equity and its relationship to mental health. It's something that I believe we all do know about on some level, and it's certainly been highlighted during the pandemic. It's not a topic that I felt was touched upon in my education or in my work as a frontline service provider. And so I really do appreciate the opportunities to talk more about the relationship and the intersections between these topics. And so I understand that we're all coming from very different experiences and understandings of the topic of mental health. And so I wanted to share the definition I most often use when encouraging people to reflect on what mental health can mean for them. So it says here, mental health is more than the absence of a mental health condition or an illness. It's a positive sense of well-being or the capacity to enjoy life and deal with the challenges that we face. I recall some survey results that had been released by the Canadian Medical Association a few years ago, which found that almost half of Canadians thought that mental illnesses are an excuse for behavior and personal feelings. And so we've had survey results over the years that really assume that people living with a mental illness are doing it as a choice. And if they tried hard enough, they could really snap out of it. We've seen lots of reports over the years of people thinking that depression is not a mental illness, for example, and that it's not serious. And so there's this continued lack of understanding about mental health and the impacts it really has on us. And so in fact, mental health affects each and every one of us, right? It's much more than the absence of a mental health condition or an illness. It's really our life experiences, our workplaces, our family environments, and the social and economic conditions that shape our lives. So there's a quote by the Public Health Agency of Canada that really sums it up fairly well. Mental health is the capacity of each and all of us to feel, think and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with the challenges that we face. It's a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnections, and personal dignity. And so it's really important to use this framework of a continuum to better understand mental health. So the presence or absence of an official diagnosis does not impact someone's ability to experience positive or poor mental health. So you'll see here from the different axes that the experience of positive mental health while living with a mental health condition, as well as the experience of poor mental health in the absence of any kind of formal mental health diagnosis. And we also believe that our experience of mental health is really grounded in the social determinants of health. So broadly, these are those living conditions, economic and social, that shape and influence our health. Some examples are, our experiences in early life, such as adverse childhood events, the gender that we identify with, our employment conditions, who forms our social safety net, our cultural and our racial identity, and many more. But the experience of our social determinants of health are going to play a very large role in our experience of positive mental health. And so we're going to talk more about equity and its impact with mental health. And there's lots of different variations or definitions of equity. If you try to research this online and learn more about it, I like to think of it as an understanding of what several groups in society have not had access to in comparison to others. So equity is a way to address that marginalization. When we talk about equality, it's the same treatment for all people. And then equity talks about the different actions that would be required to achieve similar outcomes for different individuals or different groups due to the uneven distribution of power, wealth, and other resources in society. So a lot of you will probably have seen this image before, and I still like to share it, and I'll reshare it at the very end of my presentation to show the differences over time. But equality is depicted in the image on the left, with everyone getting the same opportunity to achieve something. And so in this case, it's the same box to stand on when watching a baseball game. So in using this approach, all three individuals are kind of left in the same position that they were before. So the most advantaged continues to be the most advantaged, and the least advantaged continues to be the least advantaged. And then on the right, they've tried to show equity. So the individual receives a different box height depending on what they need in order to perform the same task. So each person has ended up being the same height and equally able to watch the game. So this is sort of a lens through which to also think a little bit more about equity. So what someone may need more or less of in order to change their experience of something going forward. So all of these come together to impact our mental health, right? So research has found that there's 3 social determinants of health that have the greatest impact on mental health. There's freedom from discrimination and violence, access to economic resources, and social inclusion. I won't define each separately because I think that everyone here probably has a solid understanding of what they are. But the one that we're going to focus on specifically is the discrimination and violence one. So discrimination are those actions that are taken to exclude or treat others differently because of their race or their ethnicity or their gender, their sexual orientation, their disability, and it creates a hostile and stressful environment for those individuals. And then violence is the vehicle through which that discrimination is acted out. So forms of abuse, of neglect, of bullying, sexual violence, state-sponsored violence are just different examples of what can happen to an individual when they're being discriminated against. And so research has found that the absence of one or all 3 have the greatest impact on our ability to experience mental health. So really what we're talking about is that equity is important for mental health. So if we have decreased access to social determinants of health, these inequities will negatively impact on our mental health, right? So marginalized groups are more likely to experience poor mental health, and in some cases, mental health conditions. Next slide. Mental health also matters for equity. So poor mental health and mental health conditions have a negative impact on our equity. And then equity and mental health intersect. So people often experience both mental health issues and then additional inequities such as poverty, homophobia simultaneously. So intersectionality creates this unique experience that poses additional challenges for individuals, for communities, and at health systems levels. So very simply, if we think about it, if you identify as female, as gay, and as a racialized person, the compounding impact of all these identities is going to impact our experience of mental health. And it's not just about the identities and what we're saying about us, but it's the experience as a result of those identities. And so all of these are heavily influenced by stigma, by discrimination, and racism, right? So there's overt forms of discrimination, and then there's covert. The overt forms are the ones that are a little obvious and clearer to see. I think back to a couple of years ago, well, there's been many examples in the past year with the pandemic for sure, but one that's always stuck out for a lot of people was when Serena Williams was depicted as the angry Black female in comics all over the world, and sort of the buzz that created. And then the covert forms of discriminations are the ones that are kind of fully embedded into our society. It's the ones that we don't know about or are unable to see clearly. And then they exclude and impose things on people, right? So when I first learned about hostile architecture, I always thought of that as a covert form of discrimination. And the point of that is sort of building public spaces that discourage use by people that are experiencing homelessness. So if you've ever noticed park benches with something protruding from them, or benches that pretend to have like single seats for people and then a handlebar in between, those are hostile forms of architecture, right? They are covert forms of discrimination. They're there to prevent someone experiencing homelessness from sleeping on that bench. And underlying all of this, of course, is the experience of racism, right? So race is a social construct. There's no biology to race. And it's really supported by institutional forms of power and of authority that use their power to advantage one race over another, right? And the next few slides will touch upon the different experiences of racism. I won't go into them in too much detail because I know I don't have too much time today. But next slide, we know that there's institutionalized forms of racism, which is structured, it's legalized, and it kind of manifests itself as an inherited advantage over another group. There's interpersonal racism, which comes through in acts of discrimination and microaggressions. And then the one that I find often is the most difficult to work with when it comes to clients and very, very dangerous and harmful is internalized racism, which is when someone has actually internalized the negative images they have heard and experienced over time about their own abilities and about their self-worth. And so each of these can be experienced separately and simultaneously, all of which again create a compounding impact on our mental health. And so all of this is experienced by our bodies as trauma, right? There was a really famous book by Dr. Gabor Mate called The Body Keeps the Score. And this is kind of the same case. When we think of all these accumulation of these pieces over time, if someone has experienced microaggressions, blocks to advancing, interpersonal forms of racism over and over again, it's going to manifest as physical and mental health issues, right? And these can come from our own communities as well. In my own community, and many of us attending today might be able to relate to this, there is such deep internalized racism on the topic of skin color, right? I remember when I first moved to Canada even, I was asked every single day how my English was so good, right? Where did I learn to speak so well? How come I didn't have an accent? And I have no count on how many times my name has been mispronounced, or my last name might have been left off of something because they didn't know how to say it. And so it's easier just to not say it at all. So these are little covert examples, right? The person saying or doing these things didn't have an outward intention to be racist towards me, but over time, they learned through their observations that this was okay to say to me, that this is normalized and acceptable ways of communicating with me, right? And so these are sort of those direct and indirect experiences of racism that are stressful and that impact our mental health. So you'll see here two images, right? The first, in both of them, there's the finish line of health. And then on the top half, the individual is kind of running toward the finish line with the support of financial resources, a completed education, and the comfort of a job. And health appears achievable in these circumstances. And then at the bottom half, you'll see someone having to go over several roadblocks on their way to health, right? So these are those experiences of marginalization we reference when talking about equity. That person will have to overcome several challenges on their path toward health. So I know I've gone through a lot of content already, but I wanted to show this as just like a simpler way to summarize some of these, right? So racism as a core underlying factor to several of the inequities we have in our healthcare systems, which affect our health outcomes. So social determinants of health combined with our exposure to our environments, stress, our ability to access services, even our access to testing and screening during COVID-19 are all linked to our health outcomes. And so pre-pandemic, there was already some research done into the experiences of racism during everyday life, and a significant number of studies reported the workplace as one of the most common places to experience different forms of discrimination. A very, very common example is the experience of microaggressions, right? Those everyday slights, those indignities, those little put downs that, you know, people of color, women, LGBTQ plus populations, and then other groups who are marginalized experience in their daily interaction with people. It'll come out as remarks, as questions, and it's painful because they have nothing to do with the individual, but it's about stereotyping an entire group and discriminating against them, right? And a key part of what makes them so challenging and painful is that they happen really casually, they happen frequently, and often without any harm intended in our everyday life. We also have heard a lot about people who feel they have to change who they are when entering their workplaces or interacting with colleagues. And so they think of this as code switching. So it's a form of survival, which also comes with the cost to our mental health. And then there's presenteeism, which is where employees will be at work physically, but they're somewhere else mentally, right? And whatever the underlying reason for this might be, the ultimate thing to take away from that is that they actually feel safe elsewhere, right? And so all of these are going to contribute to higher rates of burnout. And the good thing is that we have been able to raise the volume on some of these experiences during the pandemic. With the events of the past year, there is definitely more attention being paid by small and large organizations. Some are just for face value, and some are actually investing and considering their role in this work. But essentially, our workforce, members that are Indigenous, that are Black, that are South Asian, and from other cultural and racialized groups are living with the weight on their shoulders, right? We think of this as an emotional tax, this feeling of being different because of their gender, because of their race, because of their ethnicity, and constantly feeling like different and the odd one out affects your well-being and your ability to thrive in your job. There's been a lot of work done into this idea of putting on like armor, body armor when you're going into work, feeling on guard because of workplace bias, and the impact and the correlation of that to wanting to quit your job, right? And the experience of these people of color is substantially different than other individuals, right? So how can we possibly expect positive mental health and equity amongst different populations if they're going through experiences of discrimination in everyday life? None of us are exempt from these experiences on our mental health. I've put some stats here, but as we all know, stats are underreported, especially when it comes to the topic of mental health. But there has been some research linking the experience of poor mental health and how it impacts workforce performance, disability claims, and apparently over 80% of employers rated mental health as one of the top 3 drivers of disability claims. And so when we think about the impact of racism in the workplace, we're not talking about just like heightened anxiety one day or less sleep another day. We're talking about trauma and the impact that this has on individuals, right? So we may all experience stressful and frightening situations at some points in our lives, and we're all going to react in very different ways. Some reactions might be very short-lived and will decrease over time, and then we can cope and manage with them. But then there's reactions that can seriously disrupt a person's life, right? And so this is when the trauma takes another level, and we're thinking more about post-traumatic stress disorder as well. People will cope in all sorts of ways. A very common one that we certainly saw heightened during the pandemic was the use of substances. But I would say when it comes to South Asians, it can be really broad. One that I've noticed quite a lot is the impact it has on family relationships, this desire also to like shut themselves in and not communicate with other people because it's just too hard. And so the coping of this is where we really start to see challenges come out with our mental health. The change that we have seen this past year, though, is that for those of us who had the privilege of working from home, there was a feeling of enhanced security and safety for some people. You know, something as simple as not having our cameras on during meetings was a game changer for so many of the clients that I have spoken with. They're able to log in and work from the comforts of their own homes. They can be with their family for longer periods of time. They're not struggling with the commute of their jobs that they had to go through before. And it doesn't mean that racism has lessened. It means that it's taken on different forms, right? So we certainly heard a lot of events recently, and obviously it's very challenging to hear of these events, and I feel like the reporting of these events has gone higher, which is also helpful. It's really important to keep talking about it and addressing it. What it also means is that a lot of people have expressed to me this ability to cope with it a little bit differently, right? So many individuals who just felt like having their comfort system around them meant their cups have been a little bit fuller, and their energy to even manage these negative experiences has increased, sorry, which is what makes our current environment even harder for us. So personally, I have started going into my day job a few times a week. And after so long of being home and being able to do little things that kind of ground me and center me, we're being asked, and we're asking our staff members to let go of the unpredictability of the world around us and kind of lean into the unpredictability of entering our workspaces, which is very, very traumatic, right? This is going to bring up all those memories, those feelings that they had managed to kind of park somewhere in the back of their minds, that they had managed to calm their bodies down from back into high gear. And it's imperative that we consider these when talking about returning to work and the supports that employees will be able to access as transitions occur. And so, you know, if there are people here today in positions of management and leadership, I would ask that you look for those signs of changes in behavior by staff, changes in the way that they're communicating with you, in how they work, how they speak. You know, ask them how they're doing. I find, especially during the pandemic, there's been a lot of work that always has to be done, and fewer people will kind of carve out that time to do a personal check-in. You know, whether the employee takes it or not, extending that invitation is really important. And being really flexible, encouraging their ideas on what would work for them as this transition occurs, rethinking the expectations as well, right? So many of us have actually functioned fine in an online world, and we're thinking a lot about how we can continue online options for our clients beyond the pandemic. Why can't these work for our staff, right? So rethink what's normal for your own agency and your own staff, and build in opportunities for mentorship. I've heard a lot of people speak about the need to go in person because it builds networking opportunities, which is certainly quite true for a lot of people. But how can we circumvent that? What can we put in place so that everyone is given an equitable chance? Really embed equity in service planning and tackle the social determinants of health first and foremost. Until we talk about mental health from an equity lens, we're not truly addressing mental health. Each and every one of us has a role that we can play in embedding equity into our practice, into how services are planned and delivered, the research that we can contribute toward on equity issues. All of these are really important for us to address on the way to mental health. It's not about saying go talk to a counselor, it's about understanding what is impacting that mental health. We talk about self-reflection, which is really important in a lot of this work for developing cultural humility. So, you know, making the space for other people to share their voice, listening without judgment, and being really open to learning from them what would work for them. These actions are obviously not possible without an understanding of our own position in the world, where we are located, and the assumptions that come with that. And of course, there's a role that employees do have to play here, right? We have to encourage them to connect and talk to someone to be able to use their voice. As leaders, you're not going to be able to guess when things aren't going well. And so encouraging employees to advocate, to learn those skills so that they can express their own needs. I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide because I know I'm running short on time now. But I've left up here some questions that you could consider for your own workplaces to just kind of ask yourself what steps you're taking to increase representation and build greater safety. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this tool, the Health Equity Impact Assessment. I know Samia is here today and certainly is an advocate as well. It's an excellent tool when creating services or programs. And I would encourage you to use it even in the transition back to the workplace so that you can consider potential impacts on different communities and how to mitigate them. And so the point that we're really trying to make here is moving beyond even how to create equity right now. It's about how do we remove the systemic barriers that are all in place, right? So in the very far right, you'll see the actual wall was removed altogether, right? So how do we remove the challenge that employees are facing as opposed to just keeping on giving them fixes, which is a bigger question and maybe one that we can't get to today in one summit, but something that we're constantly wanting to work toward. And that sort of concludes what I wanted to share today. I'm happy to answer any questions. I've also left my email address here if anyone wants to connect. I have an Instagram handle, but I'm not really active on it, but I'm happy to connect over there as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sana. We do have some time for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, you can either post it in the chat or you can feel free to unmute your mic and ask your question. So
I have a quick question.
Yep, go ahead, Willie. Yep, we can hear you.
Well, I just want to acknowledge the amazing presentation. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation you put together. I was just wondering if you have any advice with regards to how organizations, whether they're non-for-profit or employers, could start with an audit or a review of their practices to deconstruct practices that could be oppressive. So like it's not a requirement by law, but it's a more proactive approach to addressing inequities that you sort of discussed. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts with regards to that.
Absolutely, I love that question, and you're right. It's not a requirement below, but of course, something very important that we all should be thinking about in our workplaces. One thing that I do highly recommend is if budget allows for it, is to bring in someone externally. I think one thing that I see often happening is the leadership of the organization trying to do this themselves, and we know that there's not enough safety for employees to be able to speak to what they're challenged with in those situations. And so bringing in someone from externally to help with that process can be really helpful. I think conversation circles then with that external person are very, very important. And partly, I think also creating a bit of a task force within your organization. So they're going to be some of the champions for this work and kind of guiding you through. But ultimately, I do think you need an external consultant to come in and sort of guide you through that process. If you want to email me, I certainly know some people that are active in this work and are doing amazing, amazing things. So just reach out.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Walid and Sana. Any other questions for Sana? So I had one question, Sana, and thank you again for the amazing presentation. And this is coming from somebody that is in a position to make decisions about how to treat staff and what kind of supports to provide for staff. And I know that with CASSA, we have a lot of young staff and a lot of youth that work with us. And so what would you recommend in terms of our approach to supporting mental health of our youth staff and our interns and our volunteers? You know, I know your presentation was really detailed, but I wonder if there's a different approach that we need to take for youth.
That's a really good question. When it comes to working with youth, I often think the most important is letting them take the lead. I think in our society, we're getting better at this, but we don't give enough credit to youth to knowing what they need for their own mental health. And the generation that's growing up right now is growing up with a very, very different approach to mental health, a way to connect with it that's very different. So I think it's really important in encouraging them to identify what will work for them, what will not work for them. And being really transparent. I've certainly had a lot of workplaces that have done things like surveys and tried to engage with their employees, but then there isn't really anything that follows from it. And so I think it's really important that if we are asking them what they need, that we are sharing back the response that we've gotten and specifically how we're going to be acting on them, because the less transparent we are, the less accountable we stay, the more we're going to lose those younger staff, right? That's not something that's going to work for them. So those are just two things I can think of at the top of my head.
Great, thank you so much. Any other questions? We can possibly take one more before we go to the next speaker. No? Okay. So we'll, if I know Kadon, you just joined, if you're okay and if you got your technical things set up, we're going to move to the next speaker. So our next speaker is going to be talking about access to critical health. So we have previously, we've actually had Dr. Nahid Dosani. Unfortunately, because of some personal emergency, Nahid is unable to join us. And we're so thankful for Kadon for stepping up to join our powerful lineup of speakers. So Kadon Diaz's commitment to building healthy communities has fueled her passion to work in the not-for-profit sector for over 20 years. In her current role as Executive Director at LAMP Community Health Center, Kadon leads a multidisciplinary team in the delivery of primary health services and health promotion programs that address the needs of the whole person, with special emphasis on areas including health equity, youth development, and education. Kadon has worked to improve access to the resources needed to help communities grow and thrive. Kadon holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree in finance from Ryerson University and a Master's of Public Policy, Administration, and Law from York University, as well as certificates in community health leadership from the Rotman School of Management and leading sustainable strategic change from the Schulich School of Business. Kadon volunteers as the chair of the board of Visions of Science, Networking for Learning, an organization that engages children and youth from underrepresented communities in education focused on science, technology, engineering, and math. Kadon will be speaking on her experience in serving racialized communities during the pandemic in Mississauga.
Hi, thank you, Samia. It's very nice to be here with you. Are you hearing me okay?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. In this Zoom world, I'm always ever conscious of connection. Great to be with you all today. This has been, I'm sure everyone will agree, an interesting year and a half, almost 2 years now, dealing with this pandemic and living through this pandemic. And at LAMP, we have, like many organizations, had to, I'll use that overused word from last year, pivot. We've had to pivot a bit to make sure that we're still able to serve our communities and that we maintain a safe environment for our staff so that we can continue to be available. The one thing that I will start with in terms of our pandemic response is that it really did highlight for us how the values that we established as an organization and the values that we espouse as an organization really came to life throughout the pandemic in the way that we served vulnerable people throughout. And our values of equity, advocacy, responsiveness, respect, and all of that surrounding collaboration. Those were our values that we established years ago through our strategic planning process. And it wasn't, you do those exercises and you think, okay, here they are. And now we continue and we'll live them, yes. But it wasn't until we were in the throes of the pandemic that we really saw just how important and those values are, because we were able to respond quickly because we didn't have to look for that guidance in terms of where our values lie. We knew them right away, and we were able to kind of take that step even faster to respond to the needs of our communities. We kept our doors open throughout the pandemic, primarily because our value system guided us in that direction. And also, there were so many organizations and support services that had to close their doors, not because they necessarily wanted to, but because so many weren't equipped to respond to the safety requirements at that time. And none of us, I mean, for many of us, this is our maybe first and hopefully only pandemic that we'll live through. But you know, so many organizations were not prepared. So many that don't necessarily deal with infection prevention and control every day. To suddenly have to, you know, be in that world, it was difficult. And so we found that so many services closed their doors during the pandemic, and we had to remain open for the community. But we were only able to do so in modified ways for some of our services. Serving people who were vulnerable during the pandemic meant that we were engaging in activities and in work that you wouldn't traditionally think of a health center doing. So in identifying issues like, you know, the food security piece that came up right away. So many families who were in need. And so part of the work that we did in West Toronto and Mississauga was providing access to healthy food for families who were in need, either as a result of, you know, job losses or other factors that impacted their families as a result of the pandemic. And so that was a very basic need that arose or increased during the pandemic or at the onset. And to this day, we continue with providing food support for families and individuals in need. The other pieces that came about were, you know, of course, we're all doing our best to serve the community. So we switched to digital platforms and virtual care and all of these different innovations to continue to serve our communities. And then notice that, again, there were some people being left behind. Low income, racialized communities, people who are living, who are precariously housed or living homeless. Those communities, those people in our communities were being left behind once again as we tried to switch to a system that would enable access. Why? Because there's digital inequity. It's wonderful to switch to virtual appointments, but what happens when your clients don't have access to a cell phone, or they don't have access to internet, or a computer, a tablet, things that so many of us take for granted, so many people don't have access to? What happens when education switches to virtual platforms and you have more than one child and only one computer? You know, we had families just trying to figure out which child would learn on a particular day because they only had one of those. So as a health center, you don't think, okay, well, why should a health center be focused on digital equity, right? And some of the work that we did during that time in collaboration with our partners was facilitate access by applying to grants to purchase computers, tablets, and even access to internet for some of our families. And that was an immense help to people because it meant opening up access for them again and decreasing isolation. And that brings me to the other part of the work that was so important during our pandemic response, which was around addressing social isolation. The cure became the cause of other health issues during this pandemic. And when I say the cure, meaning distancing and physical and social distancing from those we love and those in the community that we would normally interact with. And so in order to support that, like many organizations, we implemented, you know, warm calls. So we would call some of our clients each day, especially those who were living with mental health challenges and those who were isolated. We also supported our seniors in Mississauga. Our senior population is a priority for us. And they are one of those groups who did not have access to technology or necessarily know how to use the technology that they did have. So part of the work was supporting them with increasing their education about how to use these digital tools. And so our seniors groups are fantastic. They're fun groups that I love hearing about what happens at our seniors groups, because it's always a good time with that group. And it became difficult to connect with them, with some of them not knowing how to use the digital tools. And it's even more difficult to teach a senior, or anyone for that matter, how to use a digital tool digitally or virtually, where you're saying, where you're on the phone or you're on a computer saying, touch this and do that. It's so much easier in person for the client and for the provider to facilitate that. So those are some of the challenges we had, but we knew that we had to go that route, because that was the only way we were going to support vulnerable people, those who were elderly, and some of our racialized communities in accessing the care that they needed. The last thing any of our organizations want to do is to put in place, a service that by design leaves some of our most vulnerable out. So those were things we had to do some innovative thinking about how we would get people involved. The one thing I wanted to highlight as well was that we noticed throughout the pandemic, at the onset, that we were leaving some people behind. Some of the services that we offered prior to the pandemic included showers for people who were homeless. So they'd come into our spaces for our adult drop-in programs and access showers and laundry and telephones, so they could connect with their loved ones, or maybe a worker that was supporting them, a case manager, and food. We were able to innovate to provide the food, but because of infection prevention and control measures, we couldn't invite people in. And that was a significant issue for us, because as you'll all remember, our parks and our city facilities were all shut down. So where people would go to parks, for instance, to access the washrooms and things like that, those weren't available anymore. And so the public health guidance around isolate, social distance, shelter in place. Well, how can you shelter in place if you don't have a place, right? So we noticed that this was a deficiency in our plan as well, and worked together with community partners in East Mississauga and West Toronto to set up a space for community members who are needing to come in for those types of services, to access food, showers, laundry. And that's something that I think was highlighted during the pandemic, that made us think that this is not something that just needs a plan during this pandemic. It needs a longer term plan and a longer term solution for us to be able to serve the community. So there were lots of lessons there. And it brings me to the other piece of our work around the advocacy. And there were, I would say, maybe two streams to the work during the pandemic. There was the action stream, where we had to just respond, and we had to be quick about the response. And there were some funders who were really, really supportive, and also change their processes to be able to respond quickly and support us in responding quickly. So that was appreciated, and that allowed us to take action. But there was also the advocacy piece, and this advocacy piece was happening throughout for things like the digital equity, the food security, all of that. But that's work that we know needs to continue as we work our way through this pandemic. It's not enough to advocate for a quick fix during this time. And I think that's something that's been top of mind for us. How do we sustain some of the supports that have been in place throughout the pandemic? How do we access the resources to do that? And how do we support the community in building that capacity to advocate for themselves around some of these issues that can seem simple, but can get very complex quickly. And the other piece around the advocacy is, it's amazing for all of us to be advocates for the communities we serve. But it's such an important piece to support the community in being advocates for themselves, because organizations are great parts of the community, but community members vote. And so it's really important for us to support community members in understanding how powerful their voices are, and to be supportive of that, but to also not get in the way of them building that capacity. I think that's really important if we're going to have sustainability, if we're going to have these issues that have come up through the pandemic and that have been highlighted, be top of mind and front and center for our communities and for our leaders. So that's a key lesson that I think I've learned through this, and that's been reinforced through this. The other piece I'd like to touch on is that, over the past year, about a year now, a little past a year, we've had an explosion of awareness around some of the health equity issues related to COVID that have impacted particular communities. We've seen lots of information about the rates of COVID, the prevalence of COVID in certain communities. And we all know that the Black, South Asian, Latin communities have been impacted at a higher rate during this pandemic for reasons that have long existed in our healthcare system and our overall social system. And those issues have been highlighted for we've seen some of the sensational stories that like the George Floyd murder, for instance, or we've seen some of the issues around police interactions that are related to health that have gone terribly wrong and resulted in loss of life. We've also seen the all of what's happened around the residential school system. And I say explosion of awareness because all of these issues and the underlying issues that have created these situations have existed for a long time. And we are now, some of us are becoming more aware of it. And some of the work we've done over the last year is to be really intentional about how we address racism, how we support environments that are anti-racist, and how we build capacity and provide education around these pieces to move us forward in advancing health equity. Our organization really, at the onset, we did not put out a statement right away around the issues around anti-Black racism, for instance, because we did not want to perpetuate a cycle of, something sensational happens. We all are there and feeling distraught about it and wanting to respond and putting out statements that then just remain statements. And so our approach really was about how do we intentionally address this issue, and how do we, one, acknowledge that there will be no quick fix, and two, how do we attach some commitment to whatever statement we'd like to make. And that was really important for us because without the commitment, sometimes statements just die after it's released. That's it, that's where they sit. And so we didn't want that. And our work at LAMP and also with our partners at the Mississauga-Halton Health Equity Community of Practice, where we have identified anti-Black racism as our first year focus, that work has largely been about building our capacity. And we have to be open to learning what we don't know, be open to hearing different perspectives before we can then say, okay, we're going to fix this. So that's been our approach to the health equity pieces related to anti-racism. And some of what I can tell you that our statement that came maybe about 5 months after the George Floyd incident. And that's something that was, organizations want to come out and say, we stand in solidarity right away. It's important to kind of establish that right away. And for us, it was important. It was more important to be sincere. It was more important to be intentional. And it was more important to be clear about our commitment. And that's why it took that long. But we're really, we are happy that it took that long, because we gave it the time that it deserved in just creating that statement in that space. And we've been working with some amazing partners in Mississauga and all over Peel and Halton and Caledon, actually, around this work related to health equity and our health equity community of practice. And part of our work too is also being accountable. So we're doing the work, but how do we share this work? How do we how are we accountable to those that we serve, and our staff, our boards of directors? How are all of us accountable to each other in moving forward health equity? And that's a key piece that needs to be built into all of our processes. And that's if you hear me say anything else, that's the one thing that I think is so important. We can't just be doing work in the background or have our community trust that we're doing work in the background and just, you never hear anything about it, but it's happening. We have to be vocal about what we're doing. We have to establish that relationship of accountability with those we serve, especially around health equity and how we support vulnerable communities. So I will leave that piece there, but just wanting to highlight that it wraps up all of what we've been working on around health equity, and it's an example of why we need to pay attention to health equity, not just when something sensational happens, but in our everyday service offerings. We need to pay attention to how we are living the values of health equity and how we're supporting vulnerable people. Because if we don't do that as a piece that's embedded in our services, when we end up in situations like pandemics, those who are poorly served by our communities will again bear the brunt of the impact, the adverse impact of these situations. So happy to kind of leave it there, Samia, and open up for questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Kadon, and really appreciate your thoughts, and really kudos to you and your team for doing such an amazing job. We've been in touch, throughout the pandemic about how we can collaborate and work together with your staff as well. So really appreciate that the work that you've been doing and the resilience that your staff have showed to support the communities. So we'll open it up to questions. We have a couple of minutes before we go on our meal break without the actual meal provided by CASSA for some questions. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, or you can type it up in the chat box. So there is one question that I have somebody sent privately to me. So the question is around, sorry, did someone have a question? Okay, I'll ask my question that I have here, and then if anybody else has any questions, you can unmute and ask. So the question is around the stigma that Peel region was kind of subjected to over the last, I would say near the end of the last year. How did you see the impact that it had on the communities that you were serving in Mississauga? We saw a lot of news about a lot of infection rates in Peel region skyrocketing, and there was a lot of op-eds that came out. A lot of people had different opinions about why that was the case. People pointing to cultural factors and people not following COVID-19 protocols. So how did that affect the communities that you were serving, Kadone?
Right, thank you. That's a great question. We did see with several communities that it almost ended up at a point where it was blaming the community for the rise in infection or the number of cases in particular communities. And I think it's really important to highlight that the social factors that were at play are not the fault of the community. And so we need to, the focus was, I thought, completely in the wrong direction. We are here to support community, and there was just an incredible response from the community to COVID, but we also have to acknowledge that there are parts of our health system that are designed in ways that disadvantage certain groups. And so it's not so much, well, let's look at this community and see where they're going wrong. It's about how do we address our system so that communities have the supports needed to remain safe and to support their families. And, you know, if someone, I know in Peel it was around, okay, well, everybody's going to work and we have these crowded spaces, we have intergenerational families, all these things. And, you know, have the families and the structures of our families are things that are supportive of how we live. You know, I can tell you that I come from a household where we grew up in an intergenerational household, and it was a supportive environment for people. But when you have social factors that impact whether how people are able to access housing, how people are able to remain safe. There are lots of public health guidance about, you know, if someone in your family is exposed to COVID, they should isolate because everyone has a basement that's free and available for them to isolate in, right? So it blew my mind that the narrative went in that direction rather than in the direction of how can we support families and communities with staying safe. And of course, this impacted our communities when people are hearing and receiving information that is on toward the end of, you know, it's your fault. That's never helpful. It's never helpful in supporting communities, and it's never helpful in finding solutions and making sure that those that are most vulnerable get the supports that they need.
Awesome, great. Thank you for that insight. And you know, we had tried to respond to that kind of victim blaming earlier on, and we were connected with all three levels of government, and we did bring that as a really big concern because it led to a lot of hate and racism towards people of color and racialized communities. So I think definitely a learning moment there for not just decision makers, but also with media to be responsible in how they report and how they tell the stories in these kind of emergency situations.
Absolutely.
Any other? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
For community members as well, you know, we were hearing this notion of we're all in this together throughout the pandemic. And that was one area that I thought, you know, we should all live that piece of, you know, we're all in this together. It's not about blaming. It's about how can we get through this together. So absolutely, it in a very stressful situation, in a situation where people were feeling anxiety from all different places, where mental health challenges were increasing all around. Narrative like that certainly did not do anything to support the health and well-being of anyone.
Oh, for sure. Thank you so much for that response. Any other questions for Codone before we take our break?
It's always interesting being the thing between someone and lunch. Yeah.
Okay, so if there's no other questions,
I have
yep, sorry, go
one
ahead.
question.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Waleed.
sorry about that. You actually raised some very important systemic challenges that you had to deal with during the pandemic, and how your values informed how you kept open. And I actually really appreciated that you said that, because something I can not just relate to, but in my presentation later on in the afternoon, I'll be talking about. Um, but I was wondering, um, how what learnings have you taken away from your experiences in the pandemic, to inform your in changes to your programming, any changes to your engagement with the folks that you support?
So it's been an incredible learning journey throughout this entire thing, Waleed. And some of the key pieces that we've learned is that um, in our program and service planning, we need to be sure that the way we plan services do not, that we plan them in a way that ensures that those who are most vulnerable will continue to have access. I think I mentioned at the beginning that we were really happy to stay open, and we really quickly switched to virtual care. And it was excellent. We were able to still serve our clients. Moving forward, we know that virtual care is something that's here to stay for all of our programs, whether it's health promotion or primary health care. Um, that virtual piece is here to stay. Now the challenge for us is figuring out what's the best balance of virtual versus in-person programs and services that will best serve our communities. How do we make sure that we use a combination of what's available to us to provide service, to make sure that one, access remains, but equitable access remains. The other piece, the other piece that I think is really important, as we look ahead, is finding, like, we found interim kind of solutions to certain things, like our homeless population that we support. Sure, we set up a community support center that's open, in partnership with the local um, church and housing group and other community partners. But that's a short-term solution. And now we know that we need to develop a longer term solution that meets the needs of those most vulnerable. Because when we plan for the most vulnerable, we know that we're not going to be leaving anyone behind. But if you're planning for just the general uh, 80%, you know, people will get left behind. And so we're trying to be very intentional about how we plan and develop services. We're also trying to connect with well, well, first figuring out who are we serving and who are we not serving that lives in our community. And if we're not serving them, trying to figure out why. Applying a health equity lens to the services that we offer. And in developing services, asking ourselves, which communities benefit from this? Are all the communities that we serve benefiting from this program or service that we offer? If not, how can we make changes to make sure that those who are left out are brought into the fold? So it's this intentional look at how we embed health equity into all of what we do. It's been something that we've done, yes, but still people are being left behind. So how do we look at that? And first, you need to know who you're serving, how you're serving them, and who you're leaving behind if you're going to make changes moving forward. So that's what we are doing in terms of assessing our programs and services and making sure that we're considering people. And the other piece is building our capacity, because a really important piece of being able to serve those you have not traditionally served is making sure that you have a welcoming environment for them. And so if you're not prepared to serve that community in a respectful way that considers their needs, you'd be welcoming people into an environment that's not safe for them. And for us, it's really important. So I think of our Indigenous community members. It's fine to say, well, we want to serve the Indigenous community, but if you're not prepared and have that cultural awareness and have created a space that is safe to provide services to that community, you may in fact be welcoming them into an environment that is not safe for them to access services. So that's top of mind for us now, trying to be aware and build our competency to support the communities that that need us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kadon. And with that, we will take a short lunch break. Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a great lunch break and you were able to chat with some of the speakers that we have today and some of the attendees. So we have our next speaker for the mental health and addictions and addiction concerns panel. Manit Chahal is a passionate community change maker with over 8 years of experience of mental health nursing experience. Along with working in the field of mental health, Manit finished her Master's of Nursing in 2018, which looked at the South Asian Punjabi community's experience of accessing mental health services for depression in the region of Peel. Manit co-founded Soch Mental Health with her best friend Jasmeet Chuggar in April of 2015. Soch Mental Health is a South Asian mental health initiative aimed at providing culturally and linguistically appropriate mental health promotion for the South Asian community. Manit will lead an interactive discussion about maintaining mental balance through the pandemic. The session will spotlight the fundamentals of not just surviving, but thriving during COVID-19. So over to you, Manit.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone is having a good day. I know the weather's changed quite drastically, so it's a rainy day. Hope you're all cozy. As mentioned, I guess you guys already had your lunch break. Do make time for some afternoon tea. I think it's much needed when it's raining, that we need to have some cha, coffee, anything to warm yourselves up. Like it was mentioned, my name is Manit, one of the co-founders for Soch. Super excited to be here with all of you today virtually. It would have been really nice to be in person and see everyone's faces and see us occupy space, but virtual space will do for now. It is a quick session, so I know I'm here for 20 minutes speaking. We'll have 10 minutes of Q&A, so 30 minutes can go by very quickly. I did want to encourage everyone, depending on how your day is going, if you can be intentional, make time to engage. The session ends up being what you make of it. The more we share, the more we connect, the more we can take away. So today's session is how to care for your mental health during a pandemic. I don't think last year when things started off as they did in March, we thought in 2021 fall, we would be here. So we're going to go through some, fundamentals on how can you care for yourself during this time. Depending on your backgrounds, if you're in the healthcare space, if you're a community worker, but even outside of that, we're human beings, we're all plugged in with families. So it's really important for us to figure out how do we continue to maintain our mental wellness. So today's quick agenda, what we'll kind of be going through, every Soch session, myself and Jasmine and our team lead, we always like to start off with mindfulness. We're going to talk about self-care, do a reflective activity, talk about self-care and kind of looking at self-care and breaking it down, sharing some mental health tips and in terms of how we can get some help. So I really hope today's session is something you can take one thing away from it. If you have any questions or concerns, I do have the chat open, so I will try to respond to the chat. But once again, I encourage you as the session goes on, I really hope that you can unmute yourself. I can hear some of the voices of participants who are joining, or have you engage in the chat. So we're going to first start off with a mindfulness activity. And mindfulness is so key to taking care of ourselves in the pace of our world. I know with COVID, things have slowed down, but I think we're that much more plugged into technology. Our mind can be at a million different places at once. And so for the next 20 minutes or so that I have everyone, I would like for you to be intentional, be here, be present. So I'm going to guide you through a brief mindfulness practice. And I really hope that you will partake and join. So if you can put your phones down, just kind of sit relaxed in your chair. If you're on a couch, be cozy. And if you feel comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes. And the reason we close our eyes during meditation is that it allows us to go within ourselves. So as mentioned, ease into your chair, plant your feet on the ground, close your eyes, and breathe. During this time, I invite you to focus on your breathing. Be intentional with your breath that's going in and your breath that is going out. The song is talking about being somewhere else, being far away. Let your mind take you to a nice place far away. You're all human beings. You all have light within you. You have your breath carrying you every day. Be kind to your body, your mind, and soul. Make time to breathe. Wherever it is you are in your mind, wherever you have escaped to, know you can go there anytime. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back to our space here. Fly back to us. Sometimes I share music during mindfulness sessions and everyone likes the song. So I did share the song in case you liked it and you'd like to practice some meditation or mindfulness. I'd love to hear from anyone if this is your first time doing meditation, mindfulness, if you've practiced mindfulness, you make time for breathing, how you found it. I know it was a little over 2 minutes. So for some, it could feel quick. For some, it could feel pretty long. Anyone want to share? You can drop a comment in the chat. Do you practice meditation? Do you practice mindfulness? Was this your first time engaging in breathing?
I just wanted to share that usually with these exercises, it's usually not South Asian songs that you're practicing mindfulness to. So I appreciate the choice of music.
Thank you. Someone shared it was nice to go within. Thank you. I've been meaning to get back to meditation. Someone found it excellent. Someone tries meditation every morning. That's a great start to a session. With the work that we do, the places that we go, our lives are so busy that we live in a time in a world that we don't make time to breathe, and we forget, myself being a healthcare professional, being a nurse, we forget that the one of the strongest powers that we have within us is our breathing. And you can breathe at any point, you know, in between work, if you're a community worker, you're going to go see clients, make time in your car, right? Put on a song if you like music, sit outside, connect with nature. Your breath is so, so powerful. And when you close your eyes and you go within and you're feeling a certain way, you don't need to practice mindfulness when you're sad or you're down or you're angry. You can practice mindfulness and practice meditation when you're happy and things are neutral and things are going well. It is something that you can do for yourself intentionally every single day. It doesn't need to be 40 minutes, 1 hour. You can just spend a minute, 2 minutes of breathing, and it is so therapeutic. It is so beneficial for you. So if there's nothing you take away from today's session, if you take away the fact that make time to intentionally breathe, whether it's to slow music or fast music, it could be rap music, it could be jazz music, it could be Punjabi music, it could be anything you want it to be, it could be no music. But being intentional with your breath really helps to slow down your mind and helps everything kind of align. And that's kind of when we think about mental wellness and we think about health, that we want things to align. When we're talking about the pandemic and the impacts of COVID on individuals, families, our collective community, mental health has been one of the largest impacts and the results we're seeing of COVID. And I don't think we've seen the full effects of everything yet because we're still navigating the pandemic. We're still in survival mode, and we're going to see the effects of this for time to come. And you may see this effect in yourself, in your loved ones, in your colleagues. And this is where self-care is so, so important. And I think even putting this presentation together, I learned more things about self-care because I think we have this certain idea of what self-care means, or maybe in media, how self-care can be glorified. But I want to start off today's discussion in terms of what does self-care mean to you? So if anyone wants to share either in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and vocally share, when I say self-care, what do you think of? Whether you're doing it or not we're going to get into that, but what does self-care mean to you? So someone shared self-care is celebrating the moment with stillness for them, which is really nice. And that, for someone, self-care could be experiencing stillness, slowing down. For someone else, self-care could mean something fast. It could mean like going for a run or going for a drive. So self-care does have different meanings for different people. Someone else is sharing self-care means shutting the world of work out, which is so important to have boundaries. It could be professional work. It could also be your roles and responsibilities in your life. You could be a caregiver, and that's a role. And having a boundary and making time to step away from that can be self-care. Self-care is taking a break mentally, paying attention to what my body and mind needs in that moment. I think there's so much to unpack in that, right? Like, what does our body and mind need? It needs nutrition, it needs sunlight, it needs to have stillness, it needs to have joy, it needs to have movement. So we're gonna get into self-care and kind of like a reflective activity that I want everyone to engage in. So if you want to share this in the chat, you can. But I want you to write down your self-care practices over the last 3 days. And I also in that want you to kind of think about, did you have time for this? Did you make time for this? Because sometimes people say, I don't have time, or it's too hard. I have too many things that I need to do. And maybe even thinking about like, how has the pandemic impacted self-care? So just a bit to reflect, we're midweek right now. So I think this question is interesting if I ask someone on a Monday, like what was self-care? Because maybe their Friday, Saturday, Sunday looks really different, as opposed to asking midweek, write down your self-care practices over the past 3 days. And if anyone wants to share, do you have time for self-care? Is it hard to make time? And if you want to share any of the things that you consider to be self-care, I think it's great group learning. So I know for myself.
I can quickly share.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that self-care shouldn't be just like a one-off thing, that it should be a routine.
Yeah.
that, when you do want to respond to your body's need, it shouldn't be in a time of crisis when you're
Mhm.
hungry or
Yeah.
when you're very tired. Like, you shouldn't abuse your body. As a spiritual person, a person of faith, my religion basically demands that I respect my body,
Mhm.
and protect my body, and nourish my body, and that means all aspects, whether it's mental or physical, right? So when I think about self-care, I think about the spaces that I've created in my life for that to happen consistently, and not not to be tempted to just respond when I am in stress or respond when I'm in crisis. So those are some thoughts to share.
Thank you. I really loved how you share that self-care should not be reactive. When it's reactive, it's a temporary band-aid solution, right? And when we're thinking about mental health and mental wellness, we really want to take an upstream preventative approach and maintaining our wellness. Why wait until your cup has completely overflowed for you to respond and figure out what do I need to do for myself to bring myself back at in balance, back at bay? And also at that time, it takes a lot more. Everyone's been sharing such great things in the chat. So I really encourage you, as we're doing the session, pull up the chat and kind of take a look at it. But people have been making time for workouts, meditation, getting enough sleep. Sleep is so important. Self-care can be, I'm going to take a nap. I wake up early. I have work. I have a lot of responsibilities at home. I'm just going to cozy up and, take a nap, take a 20-minute nap, take an hour nap, and not after being like, oh my God, why did I sleep so long? What's wrong with me? Questioning what our body needs. I think what our body needs differs every single day. Making time to watch TV, a lot of Netflix. I know that happens in the fall for myself. I kind of feel like, oh, I really want to watch a show or a movie. Walking your pet, walking your dog, listening to kirtan, practicing inner smiles, making and going to medical appointments. Self-care is taking care of your body, as mentioned, and spending time in nature. There is so much power within being in nature, being outdoors. So I really hope just doing this exercise and taking a look at what was mentioned, not being reactive, but self-care is something we all have to do, must do every single day. But also in that, it's important to recognize what is self-care. So self-care is actually broken down, and I really love how there's this dimensions of wellness. Self-care could be, with the financial domain, feeling satisfied with your current financial situation. It could be looking at your environment and being around pleasant, a pleasant environment, something that's supportive. So it could be in nature. It could also be the complete polar opposite. I want company. I want to go to a party. I want to have a good social time. Emotionally, you can have emotional elements of self-care. So coping effectively with life. You could have a spiritual element that we talked about, social that I mentioned in the environment, but there's a social element too. Someone might really enjoy interacting with others and socializing. Other people might want, more personal time, intimate time. And that is also an element of self-care. You have physical self-care, your career is self-care. And I think this is where, putting together this presentation, I was like, oh my gosh, there were times in my life I was very stressed out or going through a very hard time. And work was my form of self-care. I enjoyed going to work and having a routine, and going to work was self-care. And I never really thought about it that way. Because like I mentioned, we think about self-care in terms of that glorified going on that vacation, spending X hundreds of dollars, getting that skincare treatment done. Those can be self-care, but as mentioned, we need to find self-care that we integrate into our lives every single day. And I think when you look at something and you're like, oh my gosh, that was self-care for me, I think you also give yourself credit and really give yourself that credibility that I am taking care of myself. And intellectual self-care is finding ways to expand knowledge, right? Watching documentaries, doing puzzles, doing things that are kind of like a brain teaser. That is also a form of self-care, and self-care varies for all of us. kind of an expansion of those dimensions of self-care. And I want self-care kind of broken down for everyone is hygiene, you know, taking care of our mind, body, and soul, doing a spiritual cleanse, you know, wearing clean clothes, bathing yourself is self-care, watching your nutrition, your lifestyle, environmental factors, you know, where we're deciding to create some boundaries. We might not want to be around certain people, and that is self-care. We avoid certain situations because that can be detrimental to our mental health. We have socioeconomic factors, self-medication, and as well as getting help is self-care. And I loved how someone mentioned making and going to medical appointments. Myself as a healthcare professional, honestly, I have a lot of peers that are colleagues that are in healthcare, and they don't make time for their own, you know, annual medical checkup, going to the dentist, getting their eyes examined. That is also self-care. So as kind of looking at self-care, when you looked at and you reflected on 3 things that you did for yourself, I want you to kind of come back to that list and see, you know, with this discussion of self-care being broken down into different categories and expansion of it, what are different self-care categories that you can expand on? And I'd love to hear from anyone that, especially during COVID, right? Like there might be certain things that we were able to do as a form of self-care, but now with the pandemic and a change in lifestyle, it's kind of hard to figure out, you know, let's say you know, you're a caregiver at home, you have children that are now in virtual school, you also have elderly at home. How can you make time for self-care, and what can self-care look like? I do have, you know, different types of self-care kind of shared here. That was an infographic online. I find sometimes these images can really help us expand on some ideas. But did anyone want to share certain self-care practices that are new that they integrated with COVID for themselves, or something that maybe they want to try based on some of the discussion and the information that was shared today? So you can message in the chat. I see there's a message. You can also unmute yourself and share. Someone has lost 47 pounds since March 2020. Wow, that is a lot of hard work to be taking care of your nutrition and monitoring your body. And anyone else want to share what have they been doing with self-care? Fitbit and food apps.
I can share.
Thank you.
I have got into the practice of making super healthy breakfast and having it before I start work. Just with commute and, you know, dropping off kids and all of that in the past, it was a breakfast, and a comfortable breakfast was never an option. So I've been had the opportunity to sit down and make really amazing, well thought of breakfast.
That's so awesome. And it's something that, you know, if you're doing that every single day, like nutrition is so important, what you're putting into your body. And it must feel so great to have that time to do that. I think a lot of us have gained quite a bit of time with commuting and transportation, and depending on where we're going, that we're like, we have this time and now what do we do with it? So I love the idea of you sharing intentional meal prep in the morning, which must hit so many elements of self-care, right? Like what you're putting into your body, how you're feeling, you know, in terms of energy, your productivity, and actually feeling like you've accomplished quite a bit. Someone also shared doing technology-free walks. That is so important. I think now with COVID, we are so plugged into technology. We're online, you know, for meetings. We're part of all these chats. We have so much more virtual space and virtual responsibility with how the new world is kind of evolving, that to make time to step away from that is such important self-care. Someone shared another way they like to go within has been for meditation, has been affirmations. Yes, affirmations are so powerful. You know, writing your I am statements can be very, very powerful. It really helps with your internal wiring and how your mental health is. So the reason why I really talked about self-care, and this relates to not only just surviving, but thriving during the pandemic, is that I think one thing that COVID has taught us is that things are very unpredictable and we don't know what's going to happen at any given time. And for those individuals that may have felt that, their health and wellness was in a good place, I think COVID impacted anyone and everyone. And so this is why it's so important. And I really encourage that you take today's session and kind of look at where can you implement self-care, where are you doing self-care that you can credit yourself to, and like making time for something like breakfast and being intentional with meal prep. um, um, I hope this kind of goes into the last slide that I had, that with self-care, I want you to maybe think about one thing you can do and you can make time for. And what helps with doing these things is actually having set goals, setting a date and time, and also telling someone. I think accountability helps us to be more successful with our self-care practices or any goals or ideas that we might have. So I really hope that, from today's session, you're able to take an idea of how to kind of move forward with self-care and make time for yourself. It is so critical because today you might have the choice to make time for self-care. You don't want to be in a situation where you don't have a choice. Your health is working against you and you have to do things because you have no other option, right? So we really want to exercise our flexibility and freedom. I did want to share on our Social Mental Health website, we do have an outline if you are struggling, and you can be a professional needing support, and it is okay to reach out for help and what getting help can look like. So I have this diagram that's up. It could be your family doctor, community agency, self-help, loved ones, counselor, going to a hospital if needed. So you can visit our website, socialmentalhealth.com, for more information. I also wanted to share a few self-help resources that can be a form of self-care that are very popular in the mental health field. The Coronavirus Anxiety Workbook is so amazing. It has so many incredible resources. One thing that I kind of implemented from that was following a positive news channel on social media. And I love that page. Like I go on social media, and so when I go, I see great news. I'm not seeing negative, toxic things. So really check out that toolkit and share it with people within your network. The Mind Over Mood is a self-help book in terms of working on your thoughts and how your thoughts impact your mood and your behaviors. And the last is the Anxiety Phobia Workbook. So please do check this out for yourself. Take a screenshot. I'm not sure if we're able to email out slides to all the attendees, but this is a great resource for yourself and anyone within your network. But I want to thank you. We're already at almost the 30-minute mark. I know I was supposed to leave some time for Q&A, but I was trying to make this session as engaging as possible. If you have any questions, please do reach out to us and tell someone about Soch, where we have a lot of workshops coming to the community. And we're very active on social media. We have a lot of educational videos on mental health that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. So I want to thank CASSA for having me here today. And I really hope you take one thing away from this session.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Maneet, for that really interactive and self-exploring session that you did for us today. Unfortunately, we don't have time for Q&A, but you can find Maneet in the speaker section and in the networking section. Feel free to send her a direct message if you have any questions throughout the day today, or if Maneet, you're joining us tomorrow, then people can also connect with you tomorrow. And Maneet has also provided her her email address that you can connect her with. So now we have our breakout sessions. And Madiba has been kind enough to divide our attendees in the breakout session. So we have, for each breakout session, we will have one speaker who will be speaking about their experience and their role and their program that they're leading. We will have the introduction of the speakers during the breakout session itself. Each breakout session will also have a facilitator and a note taker. So please, if you could just wait while we assign your breakout sessions. Once you enter the breakout room, room. So two of our staff will introduce themselves again as a note taker and as a facilitator. After the breakout sessions, we will all meet back in the main room here for the report back session. So again, come back to the afternoon session where the note takers will discuss each group's answers. Once we have the report back, we'll have our final speaker, Dr. Vanita Dubey, to conclude the the summit for today, and then we'll come back tomorrow. So if Madiba, you can do the honors and divide us into the breakout sessions. So just to let you know, there's 3 breakout sessions. One is data collection and decision making, which will be led by the Director of Equity, Inclusion, Diversity, and Anti-Racism, who's Corey Barnard, and the lead strategic analytics, Stephen Peterson from Ontario Health. The second breakout session is effective communication strategies, which will be led by the co-founder of the COVID-19 Made Simple and South Asian Health researcher, Janil Limbacha, and PhD researcher, Sujani Kandasamy. And finally, the third breakout session is a framework for community engagement, which will be led by co-founder of Coalition Against White Supremacy and Islamophobia, Waleed Kogali. So, and your breakout sessions were chosen when you registered. So, and we don't have the opportunity to change the breakout session that you're in. So we would really appreciate your cooperation as we work out this next session. So go ahead, Madiba. So I hope that you know, the discussions were well thought out and thought provoking. So if I can get Sakshi, Dinoba, and Abhigam to unmute yourself and provide just a quick report back. So first we'll start with Sakshi from the Effective Communication Strategies breakout. I think we may have lost Sakshi. Abhigam, do you want to start? And then we can go to Sakshi when she re-enters the room.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, we looked at, hi, hello everyone, my name is Abhigam. We looked at actually how public health data is collected, the limited number of methods which were used to collect data during the COVID-19 pandemic or ongoing, and how the data had helped them to make decisions in the public, on Ontario public health. That's one of the things that came up from it. And you look at that actually aspect, that the actually aspect was, one aspect that came to light was the fact that they started narrowing down to raise related aspect of the data a bit quite late. That caught on them. They didn't quite latch on that very early in their stats, but I think they've now incorporated it in their data collection, and it does not help them to make effective planning and decisions as regards race-based data collection when it concerns health, and they are much better prepared in case something like this arises in the future to address issues like this when it comes to that. One aspect was the fact that one aspect of this fact was that they realized that one so aspect they realized was that it was how do I put it now, that it had become the issue of stereotyping was actually coming to play in get to light in their research, that it was, especially when it comes to South Asians, people are actually attributing the spread or the rise in the pandemic to maybe their festivals or their meetings or their gatherings and stuff like that. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to say anything about that particular session? No? Okay. So then we can move on to the next report back. So that will be Dinoba from a Framework for Community Engagement Breakout Group.
Hi, everyone. So we just came out of a really great discussion with Waleed. He is an organizer in Toronto, especially within the Regent Park area and co-founded the Coalition Against White Supremacy and Islamophobia. His lens mainly comes from a community builder lens. So along the lines of the environment movement, labor movement, student movement. And so he had some really wonderful points to say. He spoke to two pillars in terms of community engagement, them being community itself and the different ways that it manifests, as well as capacity. And in order for all of those to come together, how crucial trust between organizers, stakeholders, everybody is. And so one of the things he said was that telling our story is a pivotal part of doing the work. You can do the work all you want, but if you're not telling your story, people aren't going to be involved, and people aren't going to know this is happening. So some of the work that he had done was part of CP24. It was on the Star. So to get people rolling and get your story out there. And one of the questions I asked at the end, like, to get people involved, if that work is not already being done, it's important to be able to be vulnerable, because maybe you won't roll as fast as you want. So vulnerability is crucial if this is not already out there. And so he also spoke to 5 different important points. He broke it down into the framework into 5 points for community engagement. The first one is community infrastructure. So to do an audit of what is out there in the community already, what kind of work is being done, are there grassroots organizations addressing this issue, service providers, so really just to audit and see what's out there, local neighborhood associations. He spoke a lot to the local, the residents, the neighborhoods, people who are there to vote their voices and otherwise. The second point he said was about stakeholders engagement. So identify who they are in your area. Are you coordinating with these stakeholders? Are the meetings accessible and anti-oppressive? And so again, that it comes from the bottom up. So looking into residents, who is at the table? And I thought an important point he also said was the influence of gatekeepers. So there might be folks who try to limit conversations within what is already being spoken about, and to make sure that conversations are more inclusive and addresses the issue of everyone at the table. The third point was about community voices. So ensuring that that the community voices are centered, that it's not just a top-down thing. And I'm such an advocate for that, so I really like that he put that in there too. He mentioned that there's something called a Focus Media Arts, which is in Regent Park, and they have their YouTube channel, their own platforms. And so to be able to access them, to be able to get your word out is another way that you can do that. The second last point here is community spaces. So look into if there are community spaces where you can run meetings, and it could be a physical space or it can be virtual, like we're doing. Sometimes for seniors, physical space may be more preferable. So to look into those limitations. Chronic community housing, are you booking with them for spaces, that sort of thing. And the final point he spoke about was building trust and challenging disinformation. So trust is huge, as he had already mentioned at the start. So to make sure that stakeholders, colleagues, neighbors do trust each other, and to be able to have meetings where they can converse with each other to be able to build this trust up. Another subpoint he said to that was community small discussions. So various discussions organized around certain topics. One he mentioned was the Delta variant and going back to school, giving people the opportunity to come together to speak about these things. So yeah, so those were the different ways he spoke about community engagement, and that was very interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Janoba. And finally, we have Sakshi, who is going to be reporting on the effective communication strategies.
Yeah, hi. The session that I was in was by Jamil and Sajani, and essentially they talked about misinformation and disinformation and how we could prepare for future pandemics. A couple of important ways that they've done this through their work was one way through COVID-19 Made Simple, which is a project that they collaborated with. They've created infographics that were basically a one-stop hub for easy to read information, with the main aim of really combating misinformation that's been prevalent during COVID-19. And one of the ways they've done this is through making sure that their infographics are easy to read. They targeted South Asian friends, families who had problem navigating several news sources to find legitimate information. And so these infographics were a avenue for a one-stop hub for this information. Sorry, pardon the noise. The second thing that they talked about was COVID-19 community. It was a project that they're both working on. It's the only study in Canada that's actually looking at vaccine access and effectiveness and safety in South Asian people. It's also part of this work is also surrounding misinformation. So what they did is curated sources of information and figured out innovative ways to address misinformation concerns that again has been very common in the South Asian population. Some examples or ways they've done this is through town halls with experts, live Q&As that have kind of fed into the information and ways to actually carry out this study. So under this was Say Back, which was an initiative that created that looked at sources of concerns for vaccines and developed multilingual narrative videos to address these key concerns. A key aspect of this project was actually to get youth involved, to get youth trained to disseminate these projects in their friend or family networks. And one of the ways that this project was evaluated was using pre-pass tests, and that evaluation aspect was a key factor in continually improving and adapting that project. So the overall aim of the project was to get South Asian youth involved as agents of change during the pandemic, when information was primarily being shared via social media, and getting them to also reach out to their networks and get that information out there. So a couple of things that were discussed after this presentation in the session were the fact that partnerships are key. We found that multi-sectoral and interdisciplinary teams were a great way for combating this misinformation and sharing communication regarding vaccines and combating any sort of misinformation in these communities. So a roadmap that was discussed was through several key aspects, through collaboration, collaborating with organizations that are available locally, curation, curating concerns and needs of the community, so understanding what the community needs and how misinformation is circulating in the community, creation, so creating communication strategies with collaboration with other organizations, dissemination, disseminating and amplifying these stories in different ways based on what the community's needs are. And finally, evaluating, as mentioned, evaluation was a key concern and a key way to continue this cycle and make better collaborations, improve curation, and even creation. So a couple of questions and discussions in this session were surrounding how knowledge translation or dissemination could work in rural communities. And one thing that Jamil and Sujani discussed was the fact that there are also South Asian communities in rural areas that are generally more difficult to reach, and have been low on vaccine intake. So like some strategies that were discussed was through making partnerships via local presences in those communities, trying new strategies with, for example, home organizations or home visitation where information can be shared one-on-one. So with COVID-19, a lot of our major discussions in this session were really surrounding how South Asians have a collectivist culture, and that it works well to target South Asians. And then once you start targeting a South Asian population, there's that belief that you need to protect others, and it helps to increase that uptake and obviously increase vaccination rates.
Awesome. Sounds like really amazing presentations and discussions that all of you had in all three breakout sessions. So I wanted to thank our speakers led the session and that presented at the session for doing that, and obviously the attendees as well for taking part in providing your input and your feedback. So now we have our last plenary session. After that, we hope that you will fill out a feedback form, and then we will conclude for the day and come back tomorrow. So in terms of the next session, we have Dr. Vanita Dubey. Dr. Vanita Dubey works as an Associate Medical Officer of Health for Toronto Public Health, specializing in vaccine preventable diseases. She also works as an emergency medicine physician outside the GTA. Dr. Dubey holds an adjunct professor appointment with the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health. Dr. Dubey will highlight Toronto Public Health's response to the pandemic, review COVID-19 within the South Asian community, and the importance of vaccinations in controlling the spread of COVID-19 and in preventing serious illness, hospitalization, or death. Please welcome Dr. Vanita Dubey to the platform.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. My sincerest apologies. I understand I was on the agenda for this morning and did not make it. Scheduling during COVID-19 has been quite challenging, and so I do apologize for that. Certainly did not miss it on purpose. I'm really happy to have been able to have been scheduled in and happy to be here, and looking forward to any discussion if we have time before 2 o'clock. Okay, so let's get started. So often we get this question about COVID-19 vaccine development and were steps skipped in order to get the vaccines approved. And I think it's important to know that there were no steps that were skipped or rushed in the development or the approval of the COVID-19 vaccines. There was a lot of global collaboration, a lot of research that was shared between countries, even between pharmaceutical companies and government. And that allowed the vaccine to be approved in December. I want you to know that as of September the 16th, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine are now licensed under the Food and Drug Act in Canada. So they are now approved under the normal regulatory process in Canada. In Canada, we described it as the interim order. The US describes it as the emergency certification. So the interim order has expired, and these vaccines are now approved under the normal regulatory framework. So I think that's also really important to remember. That's why actually the vaccines have names, trade names now, some of which are very difficult to say. And so that again is another piece, many months later, that helps to show that the vaccines, their process has been sound and just. So what is in the COVID-19 vaccines? It's actually probably more important to know what's not in the vaccines. I mean, the vaccines themselves, speaking particularly about Pfizer and Moderna, because those are the two vaccines that we have available right now in Ontario, they have the instructions, the messenger RNA, which are instructions for your body to make antibodies. So that messenger RNA, which is extremely fragile, needs to be protected. And so it's wrapped in lipids, sugars, salts, and buffers. But look what's not in it. There's no eggs, there's no gelatin, there are no preservatives, there's no latex, there's no antibiotics. I know some people ask, are the vaccines kosher or halal? Well, there are no animal products in the vaccines, these two. There's also no COVID-19 virus. And so you cannot get COVID from the vaccines. Now, what about the side effects? Well, we know that you can expect side effects after a vaccine. Some people can, if they get side effects, again, maybe 10 to 20% of people will have a sore arm, redness, not feeling well, headaches, nausea, vomiting even. Those side effects are expected and can last for 1 to 3 days. There are a severe side effect to watch for, and that is myocarditis and pericarditis following the messenger RNA vaccines. If someone has chest pain, trouble breathing, palpitations, those are signs that they should seek medical attention, especially if it occurs within the first week following vaccination. We know that this side effect occurs more commonly after the second dose in young adults or youth, and especially in males. But what we also know is that this side effect is on the milder side, and most people recover on their own, just with rest and treatment at home. And so the vaccine continues to be recommended when you balance the long-term effects of getting COVID, getting severely sick from COVID, even long COVID, compared to the side effects even of the vaccine. So what about the fourth wave? What about the Delta variant? Do the vaccines still work? And the answer is yes, a resounding yes. We actually have new data in Ontario that continues to show that we have good vaccine effectiveness even against the Delta variant. But what we know is that you need both doses of the vaccine to get that stronger protection. So in the third wave, we had the Alpha variant. With one dose of the Alpha variant, we actually had very good protection. But if you look at that second image there, that shows with the Delta variant, that with that second dose, it increases our efficacy that much more with the second dose. And that's why we're actually really recommending that second dose be given as soon as possible to people. We know that the Delta variant is more infectious, which means it can spread more easily, and that's why we need that good protection. This is one of my favorite graphs. It just shows, so the bar graphs, the green, show the cases of COVID in our city, in Toronto. And so it actually shows it that the third wave, and then, you know, in the spring, and then down you can see the small increase in cases on the bottom right there. But if you follow the line is vaccination rates, and you can see that as vaccination rates increased, the case numbers declined quite substantially. And it's that purple line that shows fully vaccinated, 2 doses or more 14 days ago. And that is just, I think this is just a great example of how vaccines really do work and make a difference. So what can we say about COVID-19 in Toronto? Well, and what about among ethnic groups? Well, we know in particular among South Asians and Indo-Caribbean populations that they have been significantly burdened by COVID-19. We saw that actually in all of the waves. They make up 22% of COVID cases in Toronto, compared to 13% of our population overall. And so this is all the more reason why we need to ensure that South Asians get vaccinated. So what are the ways to get vaccinated in the city? Well, the city of Toronto still has mass immunization clinics. There are 5 of them. Woodbine Mall was just added very recently. They are all across the city. No appointment is required. The vaccines, anyone can just walk in Tuesday to Saturday from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. And OHIP is also not required. There are also other clinic locations. And so we also have kind of shifted our strategy to a mobile clinic strategy. And so there are many, many mobile clinics, hundreds that occur within the week. And organizations can actually request to have a mobile clinic set up near their school, their mall, their place of worship. We're certainly working with community groups to have those clinics accessible to, especially in populations where the vaccination rates are not great, or where there's a large number of people who are still not vaccinated. You may have heard of VaxFax. It is an excellent resource, a virtual visit to a physician if you have questions about vaccines. And so definitely recommend promoting this for those so that they can speak to a credible resource, and especially a physician, to talk about their questions about vaccines, rather than going to other sources where we know misinformation is rampant. What are the reasons? So what are the common reasons why people chose to get vaccinated? So this is based on a survey that Toronto Public Health did using Ipsos Reid to ask people why they got vaccinated. And I think some of these statements are important to remember and to share because they may help to convince other people to get vaccinated. So I got vaccinated to get life back to normal, not to get sick with COVID, not to spread COVID-19 to my family, friends, or in my community, to be able to travel, to be able to gather with friends and family again without restrictions. So I know this is a very common question. Do I still have to wear a mask if I'm vaccinated? And the answer right now is yes. We're in the fourth wave. We still see cases of COVID, about 100 a day, 140 a day in our city alone. And each case of COVID can spread to 5 or 6 or 7 other people if we don't have high vaccination rates and some of these other measures in place, like wearing a mask and physical distancing. We've actually seen in the past many weeks what we call a plateauing of our numbers. And so the efforts that we're all taking to prevent the spread of COVID work. We know they work. They've worked previously. They work without having to be extreme this time with lockdowns. That is our hope. And so that's why we are still recommending wearing a mask, especially in those indoor settings, especially if it's crowded, better even to avoid it yet. Stay outdoors as much as possible. Stay sick, even if you're vaccinated. If you have one symptom of COVID, vaccinated or not, you must stay home and get tested. Maintain that physical distance, and then, of course, washing hands as much as possible. And this is just some information to share. Toronto Public Health Hotline, it is open 7 days a week, 8:30 a.m. to 8 p.m., 416-338-7600. Interpretation services are also available, but we also have texting options, Instagram, Twitter, and our website is constantly being updated. I review a lot of the content, even on a daily basis, and so keep checking back on our website for the latest as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dubé. So we do have 10 minutes for Q&A, but before I open it up to the audience, I had a question for you. And that question kind of revolves around communication with racialized communities in your response to the pandemic as a public health staff. So I know that at the beginning of the pandemic, and there's so many things that have changed, that we're changing every single day. We're getting new information, new public health measures were coming out as we learned more and more about the virus and how to protect ourselves. So I'm wondering internally, what was that process of deciding earlier on this year, like at the beginning of the year and late last year, that there needs to be targeted approaches when communicating and supporting different communities with racialized communities. What was kind of the breaking point or the factor that led to now this, vaccine engagement strategy, which we're part of as well. And you have these clusters and working with organizations and really focusing on targeting marginalized and racialized folks. So just wondering what was the internal process there?
Well, I think one of the big driving factors was the data. And I think this was a regular talking point. I mean, we could only really comment on the data once we had some of that racialized data. I think early on in the pandemic, we were able to show based on neighborhoods, based on the population levels where people were getting COVID, that it was disproportionately affecting certain neighborhoods where racialized communities lived. And then when we had some of that specific data to show that certain racialized groups are disproportionately getting COVID for a variety of different reasons. In public health, we call those the social determinants of health, that it's income, it's poverty, it's neighborhood, it's newcomer status, it's language that you speak, it's all of these things that can play into why people may be more likely to get COVID. And likewise, we know for vaccine uptake, vaccine confidence, that it can also be very much rooted in an individual circumstances. Culture plays a big role, language plays a big role. And so I think there's no question that one size fits all approach does not work, especially in a city like ours, which is so diverse. And I think it's fair to say that we continue to learn from our partners like you that are on the ground. One of my favorite sessions that I do on a monthly basis is with the community ambassadors, and hearing from them about what they're hearing from the people that they're interacting with. What are the common questions now? And then we can go back and develop resources. We've also made a concerted effort to have to be able to share that as well too. Social media has not been our friend. We know that social media has actually been extremely detrimental, WhatsApp, Facebook, in sharing really false information. And so it's really not up to public health to combat that alone. And that's why it's all about partnering with organizations to get those messages across.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. So there's some questions that are coming in through the chat to me directly to pose to you. Lakdeep, do you want to unmute and ask some of your questions? I'm not sure if I'm going to phrase it as you want it.
Thank you. No, these are just questions that I'm hearing in some of my networks. And so I put it out to you, doctor. Is there, if I can get it and pass it on to others, is it still a vaccine? That's question one. So I'll go there. And
sure.
then
Let's talk about that. Yeah, let's talk one at a time, because let's do the first one. So the goal of the vaccination, I think, let's be clear, right now it's to prevent the severe illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. And what we know is that the vaccines, even in Ontario, even against the Delta virus, work more than 90% of the time to prevent those hospitalizations and deaths. The vaccines are not 100%. I mean, I think people expect them to be 100%. They aren't. We certainly don't ever claim that they are 100%. They work very, very well. But especially with the Delta virus, if you're vaccinated, you can still get COVID, much lower risk. And so let's talk about that. In fact, on the ontario.ca website, they now have the data broken down by vaccinated and unvaccinated. And so we know that if you are unvaccinated, you're 7 times more likely to get COVID in general. And so that already shows disproportionate about how much lower your risk is when you're vaccinated. If you end up in the ICU and you're unvaccinated, you're 40 times more likely to end up in the ICU being unvaccinated compared to being vaccinated. So I think that's part of the answer here. We know that people, I can say from the cases that I've investigated, people who are doubly vaccinated and are getting COVID, for the most part, are getting a very, very mild illness, a runny nose, a stuffy nose, not really feeling that ill. And the goal right now, really, in this fourth wave is actually to preserve our healthcare system. And I think it actually takes me a long time to understand what that means. So that means that we don't end up in a situation where when I have a heart attack, I can't get care for my heart attack because our hospitals are full of COVID patients. And so that's really our goal right now. And the vaccines we know work to prevent people from getting so sick that they end up in hospital.
Great, thank you. And Lakdeep, do you want to ask one more question from your list of 3?
Thank you. These are questions that are often posed in my network, so I'm just kind of like I'm asking the experts in my life. So this is a great pleasure. Thank you for this opportunity. Another one that I often hear about is there fetal matter in the casing, in that transport delivery of this vaccine?
No. Yeah, no. So I know I actually had this question recently from a human rights perspective. And so in the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, they did not use any fetal cell lines. And people often talk about an aborted fetal cell line. So going back many decades, there was a cell line that was used for the production of certain vaccines. Aborted in medicine means that the baby left the mother's womb. And so a miscarriage would be an abortion as well too. So anyways, there was a fetal cell line from there that is sometimes talked about among anti-vax people. That cell line was not used for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. I understand that it may have been used for either AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson, but those vaccines are not the ones that we're giving here. So I think that that's important to note.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions? So there's a question in the chat about the changes to the efficacy of the vaccine as new variants are coming out and making the process of or trying to convince people to get vaccinated makes that a little bit more challenging. So how do you navigate that and try to explain to people, despite the variants that are coming, it's still important to get vaccinated?
Yeah, I think actually it's a good news story because of the variants that we've had so far, the vaccines actually have been effective. And so the Alpha variant was what we had for the third wave. Now in this fourth wave, we have the Delta variant, and our vaccines are still holding up and proving to be still very effective. There is, maybe part of that question is about booster doses as well too. Right now, people who are recommended for booster doses are people who have some sort of a weakened immune system, maybe because they live in a long-term care, they're a frail elderly, or they have, they're on chemotherapy or taking some strong drug. And in which case, the booster dose is to boost their own immune system to give them that better protection. But for the variants right now, the vaccines continue to be very, very effective, and including the Delta variant, which is our current and immediate threat.
Great, thank you so much. We'll take one last question from Samia, and then we'll have to wrap up for the day. What are some equity concerns around mandating vaccine passports, and how are these addressed?
Okay, so I think this is a really good question. Actually, health equity is something that we talk a lot about in public health. And actually, the equity conversation goes on both sides, actually. And what I would say first and foremost for equity is protecting people who are at higher risk for COVID is a health equity concern. And we know that these racialized populations, including South Asians, are at higher risk for COVID, probably because of the exposures that they have to COVID based on their work or where they live or what have you. And so we need to be able to protect those populations who are more vulnerable for whatever the reason, and vaccination is the way to do that. In terms of the passport system itself, it is being applied for non-essential services. And so, again, that is a way to help us to carry on with our activities without having to lock things down. And so from an equity perspective, it's non-essential. For those who, for whatever reason, have not been vaccinated yet, the goal of these mobile clinics is to be able to be in neighborhoods and places where people who can't access the vaccine are able to access it. So I think that that's another way to think about it from an equity lens.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dubey. I know you have a hard stop at 2 o'clock, and we also want to be true to our word and end the first day of the summit at 2 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody once again for being here. There is a feedback form. So if you weren't able to complete it during the pop-up during Dr. Dubey's speech, if you can go to the main platform, the feed loop platform, right above the video, there is a button called check-in survey. So if you want to take the next 5 minutes just to click on check-in survey, complete that. Once you're done, feel free to log off and carry on with the rest of your day. And we hope to see everyone back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. for another set of amazing speakers and great sessions. So please do the feedback form because it does help us. And as you know, we are using a new platform this year, the Feedloop platform, and we're hoping that for next year we can do it in person again. Fingers crossed. We hope all the public health measures work, and we can beat this virus and get back to our normal routine. So thank you everyone once again. Please fill out the feedback form, and we'll see you again tomorrow.